Why are Canadians elbowing up? That's coming up. Hello and welcome to Church in Maine, a podcast for people interested in the intersection of faith, politics, and culture. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Now, I've shared this many times before, but I grew up in Flint, Michigan. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the geography of where I grew up, because where I grew up in Michigan is kind of unique. If you head an hour south, and I did say south, you would be in Windsor, Ontario. This is one of the few places in the United States where you actually, in Detroit, can actually look due south into Canada. If you went an hour east of Flint, you'd be in Sarnia, Ontario. Because of the kind of the closeness to Canada, we had access to the local Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, or CBC affiliate from Windsor, and I would watch it. And especially in high school, I would watch the evening news every night because I'm a nerd. But for me, I loved learning about this nation next door that was similar to us in so many different ways, but also different. Now, Canada and the United States have had a long and friendly relationship with each other. It was not uncommon for me growing up. When we went to the mall here or in Flint, you'd see a lot of Ontario license plates. And it was also not uncommon for a lot of people in Michigan, and especially also the other surrounding states, to head up, spend a weekend in Windsor, or drive up a few hours out to Toronto or other places along the way, or Niagara Falls. This has kind of been the relationship between our two countries. We've had this very peaceful border. We've had these very peaceful relationships. And the emphasis, of course, is on the word had. Things seem to change pretty much as soon as Donald Trump was elected president again last November. He started talking late last year about raising tariffs on Canada. And started to refer to then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau as the governor of Canada, and referring to Canada as the 51st state. Now, some people thought that he was joking. Maybe this was some way for him to get what he wants when it comes to trade. But no, he wasn't joking. It seems like President Trump does want to see Canada as a 51st state, and has been willing to place significantly high tariffs on Canada. Now, there's a funny thing here, that when someone talks about annexing your nation, the people in that nation tend to get a bit upset. Trump's actions have really fired up Canadians. They have started boycotting American products. They have decided to cancel plans to travel to the United States. And this has even had an effect on the upcoming Canadian elections, which are scheduled for the spring. In the months leading up to when those elections were called, it seemed like Pierre Poilievre, who is the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, very well is probably going to be the next prime minister. Justin Trudeau, who was prime minister up until I believe it was late March, had been the prime minister for about 10 years and leader of the Liberal Party, and their fortunes were slipping. And it looked like Poilievre was going to win. The Conservatives were going to have a majority. And then Donald Trump spoke, and the race has changed. The current prime minister, Mark Carney, may actually bring the Liberal Party back to power. So here, that's kind of the interesting kind of level political look at this. But I was curious of how Canadian Christians are looking at all this. So I decided to speak to one. I spoke to Anglican priest David Harrison. David has served as a priest in rural, suburban, and urban settings in Ontario. And he shares his observation on the American-Canadian relationship, how Canadian Christians are kind of navigating this current landscape, between kind of feeling at times this revived Canadian nationalism, but also their Christian witness. Now, if you're an American listening to this, I think it's always important to listen to how our sisters and brothers north of the border see issues, especially this issue. And also to hear what advice they may have for their American cousins. So I really hope that you will listen in to this great episode with David Harrison. Well, David, thanks for joining me this afternoon to chat. I think the first thing I wanted to do is to introduce yourself, kind of a little bit about who you are and your faith background and what you do.
Sure. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's good to be talking to you across the border. And I know that's going to come up in our conversation. I'm speaking to you from downtown Toronto. I'm what they call a cradle Anglican. And I always have to be careful when I'm speaking to someone from the U.S. to define Anglican. I actually did my Doctor of Ministry at Bexley Seabury in Chicago.
Okay.
And so I learned this because I'm part of what's called the Anglican Church of Canada, and our sister organization in the U.S. is the Episcopal Church. Mm-hmm. But the word Anglican can I gather in the U.S. denote some folks who have broken away from the Episcopal Church. So I'm part of the Anglican Church of Canada. I have been all my life, and funnily enough, my spiritual journey started about 3 blocks from where I'm speaking to you right now at St. James Cathedral, which is the cathedral in downtown Toronto. I have a musical bone in my body, and at the age of 7, which is a long time ago, I became a member of the choir there. And it was an all-consuming part of my life. Choir boys were there Tuesdays, Wednesdays after school, Friday nights, and all day Sunday. So that's how I was formed in the church and in the liturgy and in music. And after a first career of about 10 years in public service, I was ordained 25 years ago as an Anglican priest. And I served in parish ministry for about 20 of those years. I have not served in parish ministry for about 5 years. I've been doing other things. And now, interestingly, I find myself working in the United Church of Canada. And I'm speaking to you from about just up Church Street, where there's the Anglican Cathedral and there's the Roman Catholic Cathedral. And right in between is Metropolitan United Church, which is a big cathedral-like building. And I'm actually serving as the interim director of administration. So I run the operational side of this congregation. So I'm kind of working along people in ordained ministry, but I'm not functioning here as an ordained minister. I'm just exercising other gifts and still kind of in my late 50s, enjoying the different vistas of the church. So I speak to you from a lifelong experience of church going and with a connection and an understanding of those two mainline so-called Protestant denominations. So I'm through and through a church person.
Right. Well, I think one of the things we wanted to talk about is obviously kind of what's kind of going on within U.S.-Canada relations, which is kind of something I never thought I would ever say, because I think our relations between our two countries we've just kind of, for a long time, have taken them for granted that we have always been allies, we've always been close. I personally, I grew up in Michigan, in southeastern Michigan, so I was basically an hour in 2 directions, to the east and to the south, to Canada, and was, it was not unusual to go to Canada and everything. But obviously in the last few months, things have changed. And I think one of the things that part of this conversation is to talk about how is that affecting especially Christians in Canada, and how has that changed? Because it seems like there has been, watching this from the other side across the border, there's actually been a big change in how Canada is viewing itself, in the last 90 days. And so I guess probably to start off is, how has that affected people in churches?
There's no question everything you say is accurate, and that change really has been in the last 3 months. And as you know, we're in the midst of a federal election right
Mm-hmm.
now for our national government, and that election is just under 3 weeks away. So this stuff would be present anyway because of the potential economic disruption of tariffs. But it's even more in the consciousness of Canadians because we're about to elect a new government. And so I think about this in a number of different ways. I think I would start by saying that there's anxiety within Canada for anxiety about. We already were dealing with acute problems with affordability because of inflation, and economic dysregulation. We were already dealing, at least in major cities like this one, with a crisis of homelessness and addiction. So these issues were already huge. And the reality we expect of tariffs and a trade war is that the economic disruption has only become more acute, which makes everything, all of those issues of human living, that much more difficult. So I would start by saying I sense there's anxiety, and I hear people in prayers, in sermons, in how things are presented, speaking to that reality and saying, in times of anxiety, in times of disruption, our faith and our communities can be resources. So I think that's at a very basic level. I think that's a response from the church. Canadians are very conscious that churches need, because of our charitable status with the federal government, need to be very careful about being nonpartisan.
Mm-hmm.
So Canadian churches will always be extremely cautious to say anything that's too overtly political, and Canadians tend to be fairly polite. But people talk, and that sense of anxiety is real. And I think churches feel that they have an opportunity to be a place of solace in the midst of that. But at the same time, I'd also say that because mainline Christianity has been on a long-term decline for 60 years, really, in Canada, since the early to mid-60s, and that decline has been accelerated by COVID. Finances are a concern. I mean, churches, even healthy churches, are still worried about finances, and they're
Mm-hmm.
worried about givings, and they're worried about older givers dying, and sustainability and the buildings. I mean, we have this huge building right now, and that's a huge issue for us. So at the same time, that anxiety cuts to the core of sustainability of the church.
Mm-hmm.
You start to think about, okay, how do we sustain our future financially? And then people say, and I've heard it at board meetings, but Trump tariffs and inflation, and is this the time to be ambitious about the future? So it has, I have more to say, but at the very basic level, those are two dynamics that I think are really quite alive in the church, as the church is part of the wider Canadian society that's dealing with this reality.
And how, especially specifically, we've talked about the tariffs, that's actually something that has happened, but also kind of the rhetoric that has been coming from my side of the border, talk about Canada becoming a 51st state. And I think, as we talked before the interview, I was worried about America going isolationist, and it seems we've decided, no, we're going to be expansionist. Um, how has that affected, and what type of anxiety has that really brought to people? Um, and how have people responded to
Sure.
that sense of anxiety?
Well, you talk about rhetoric, and we certainly hear it. I mean, I think in the States you get very little Canadian news, but we get all kinds of American news,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So there's a mismatch there. We know everything that's going on in your country, but you know very little about us. Um, um, so I think that's also, along with the anxiety, economic anxiety, has been a renewed sense of Canadian nationalism.
Hmm.
I'll give you a couple of tangible examples of this. During COVID, we had a time where people who were against COVID vaccine mandates and generally against our federal government occupied downtown Ottawa, our national capital, with trucks for weeks, with a
Hmm.
convoy, and they flew Canadian flags. So there was a time for the last 3 years when you see a Canadian flag, you immediately suspect that's probably someone on the right who doesn't want, is against COVID vaccines and wants to, who swears to the prime minister and has, it's actually redeemed the Canadian flag.
Hmm.
Now you say, oh, actually, now that's actually a point of Canadian nationalism. But this is a double-edged sword, in my view, as a Christian. So in the congregation I'm serving now, for the last 3 Monday nights, we have hosted rallies called Elbows Up Toronto, and this is part of Elbows Up Canada. And we're hockey people, right? So I don't play hockey, but elbows up means you're going to be aggressive and you're going to go hard into the corners. The Canadians are taking, in the midst of the anxiety, they're taking on that kind of rhetoric. And I get it, but I've also had people, even at these rallies, say, but isn't that an aggressive response? Isn't that a almost, verging on violence? And we're not
Hmm.
talking, but so, I mean, I think this brings to the fore, at least for me, and I think for others, this tension between being proudly Canadian, rejecting any sense that we would be the 51st state. And someone said, well, we may be the 51st to 60th state because there are 10, that's 10 Senate seats. That's more representative people in the House of Reps in California. Be careful what you pray for. So that is surfaced, and I think it's surfaced for Christians.
Hmm.
But I think that's also it is in tension with some basic principles of Christian living, which I would argue focus ultimately on our citizenship in the reign of Christ,
Hmm.
or to use more masculine language, the kingdom of God, where the currencies are not trade barriers and pipelines and all that, but is love and justice and mercy and grace and all those things. So I think it does bring forward those tensions, and I think that in terms of political decisions, now I'll name it. I speak from a kind of progressive Christian point of view. And and progressive in Canada, it's even more progressive than the U.S. on the whole.
Hmm.
But I even find myself sort of thinking, okay, I'll give you a tangible example. Um, we are being challenged as by your president and by others around the world to increase our defense spending substantially because
Hmm.
we do not achieve, I think it's the 2.5% of GDP that NATO is requiring. Um, and I, generally as a Christian pacifist, would have been, I don't really want to spend more money on the military, and I'm just not comfortable with that world. I find myself saying, oh, well, I think we probably got to do it. And so that's where, for me, a Christian value um, and sense and a national value come into conflict. And I think I see that happening. And I think that's probably going to be part of the tension that we live in as Canadian Christians, mainline Christians, for some time.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'll stop there.
How do you think you manage that tension? Because I think that we all come into some point in our life where we have certain values, and then all of a sudden the situation changes.
Yeah.
And so how do you manage that? And knowing that it it might have to have some give and take in those times.
I personally, I think I answer that with a theological response, which is incarnation,
Mm.
um, which is to say that in anything we do as individual Christians, or anything we do as an institution, we are always by virtue of the very nature of God's creation, we're always dealing in this world. And this world is not unimportant. We aren't generally people who say this is just ephemeral but we live it. And, we have flesh and bones. It's money. I mean, we get salaries and we get a more expensive job. We get better salaries. I mean, that is not a gospel value, right? The last person gets the same. That we don't actually operate that way. So I'm concerned about my retirement savings, frankly, and I've watched them go down over the last few days with alarm. Right? I share all these concerns. So I think the challenge is always to be realistic about that, but then to always be challenging ourselves in our prayer lives, in our lives of proclamation, in our preaching, to not lose sight of that inherent tension between a nationalistic elbows up reality and the call of Christ. And I think it's better to name that than to not. Mm-hmm. And I would say attention for most Canadian Christians, not all, is that President Trump at least nominally speaks out of a Christian a Christian conviction. I mean, I remember one interview. The Bible is my favorite book, and then asked to name his favorite. He couldn't come, but that's true in Canadian culture, in Canadian Christendom too. But it's a much smaller proportion. Mm-hmm. So I think that's also an opportunity for Christians in Canada to proclaim, but also to live a different value. We took great notice of the Bishop of Washington's speech at the inauguration service. Bishop, that was well commented on, and those who said she had no business doing it, but I think most the people, at least in my world, would say, good on her. I mean, what prophetic courage that took. So how do we hold on to that prophetic edge of our faith, all the while recognizing that, we do live geographically over the North Pole, between Canada, between the U.S. and Russia. We do have these real things, and so we're always going to be looking through the glass darkly. We're always going to be living this side of that kingdom, and having to accommodate those realities, but without maybe losing our Christian soul.
Mm-hmm. How do you think, kind of looking, I guess looking forward or looking in, well, let me rephrase that. How do you think that the relationship that has been between our two nations is changing? And how is that happening, especially within churches? Do you see Christians within churches having a very different outlook about the United States than they did 3 or 4 months ago?
I think it's there. I think it's more general to Canada. But I mean, I know many people who said, I'm not. The organizer of these Monday night events, who's a former mayor of Toronto, said, we used to go to New York City once a year. We love it. We have not gone since 2016, and we're not going back. And I hear that again and again and again. People aren't going. Mm-hmm. So partly that means that we have less experience of the life stuff of the border. There's also huge issues now in terms of getting across the border, and phones being investigated and so on and so forth. So I can see there's going to be a pulling apart, but I think there actually could well be an opportunity. This isn't specifically about the Christian church, but it's about an adjacent organization, the Hymn Society of the U.S. and Canada, of which I'm a member, which is based in the U.S. They have just called for, and it's happening next week or the week after, for a symposium, an online symposium, where they're encouraging people from both sides of the borders simply to talk and to open up channels of communication. And I could see that happening within Christian organizations as well. We are, I'd be interested to see if something develops between the Anglican Church of Canada and the Episcopal Church, or between the United Church of Canada and probably the Crawlers, the United Church of Christ in the U.S. Whether those kinds of connections can be made and those conversations opened up as a counterbalance. I think Canadians recognize that there are lots of Americans who who are empathetic to the situation, and we get news about that. So I think the issue is not with Americans per se;
Hmm.
it's with your government and with the institution, and that's I mean, we're not occupied, but there, this is not unlike where Christianity found its roots in an occupied territory. I mean, we
Hmm.
are. I mean, there are some crawlies. We're not absolutely politically occupied, and where does the reality of human relationships and human empathy and a shared a cohesion to the gospel, where does that create more affinity, even when there's other disconnect? Let's hope so.
How do you think that Christians can, especially in Canada right now, and you kind of again talking about this pull between nationalism and also your faith? What is the Christian witness, do you think, in this time, for the rest of society?
Simply, well, not simply. I think it's to care for the least.
Mm.
When I was naked, when I was hungry, and that's the I'm we're surrounded here. We're right next to a hospital. We're surrounded by people who are living on the street who are deeply addicted, and that reality is always there. And it can be easy when you feel threatened yourself to draw in, right? And if we've just lost money on the market, well, I'm going to be. How do I, am I going to pull away my support of that? So I think the Christian witness is to look directly into the economic crisis that we're already in, but which is certainly looking like it's going to intensify. And how do we be a witness to that? Which is, um, at its most basic level, clothing and feeding and sheltering and healing.
Hmm.
But also, how can we help those who seek it um, grab hold of some reality of faith? I mean, we would offer our Christian faith, but some reality of faith which can anchor us in. I mean, to use an old hymn, anchor us in stormy weather. I mean, there's nothing new here. You are anchor hold. That's and I think when life is easy, it's easier to let that go. And when life is more stressful, that can be a time when people seek that out. So to also be that place of succor. We open this church is open for several hours a day, and we have people come in every day, just to be in a magnificent, transcendent, and quiet space.
Hmm.
Okay, okay, that's enough. That's
Hmm.
enough. I'm not worried about our institutional survival. We are, but how can we fundamentally be about the gospel that was proclaimed and that we uphold?
So you talked a little bit about the concerts that have been taking place, um, and I think our mutual colleague Martha Tatarnik has talked about those as well. Could you kind of tell me a little bit more about what those have been like?
Yeah, they've been partly concert, but they've been more like a nonpartisan rally.
Hmm.
So it's been 3 Monday nights, and we're taking a break for Holy Week, and they'll be back after that. And they are public events which are drawing 3, 4, 500 people to a church, and to have people speak. The mayor of Toronto has spoken, a former premier of Ontario, a couple former mayors, a retiring member of parliament. We've had artists. We had a great show, which I think some Americans have seen, called Schitt's Creek.
Hmm.
Well, one of the actors in there was here on Monday to sing. He's a singer, Noah
Oh,
Reed,
cool.
and
Okay.
he's fabulous, right?
Hmm.
So there've been times for people to come and actually share, um, how at this time we can make a better society.
Mm.
When we're under threat, how can we make a better society? What do we need to do in terms of homelessness and housing? What do we need to do in terms of the climate? And I mean, nonpartisan, but I would say a fairly progressive left wing perspective. Um, and the fact that on very little notice, that first Monday night 2 weeks ago, that the place was packed with 600 or 700 people with virtually no publicity, says something
Hmm.
that, and there've been older people, some younger people, people with families. So, that's a movement, and so it's not, these are not our events. We're providing the space, and the infrastructure. Um, I think it was a wonderful moment the first night. One of the deputy mayors, or maybe she's the only deputy mayor of Toronto. Her name is Aslam Malik, and she's Muslim and she wears a burqa. And she stood up at the front, and she was right in front of our, I call an altar, but a table, which has a relief of the Last Supper. And she stood right there, and she looked around and she said, "This is one of the most beautiful gathering spaces in the city of Toronto." And I thought, wow, this is this is a
Mm.
beautiful gathering space in the city of Toronto where people of different faiths, different perspectives can come and talk about these things. Not an explicitly Christian perspective, but I think that the church, at its best, can be that kind of convening space for civil society. And I was thrilled to think that this church in the downtown Toronto could be described that way, by the deputy mayor of Toronto. I think there are moments like that, but that's what's going on with those events, and that this is a movement across Canada. So I suspect it may be happening in other places. Whether it's happening in churches or not, I don't know.
Do you think that this could revive any type of a civic function for the church, especially for mainline Protestantism in Canada?
My office is surrounded by the organ, so I don't know, you can hear it, but the organ's playing. So,
I can, yeah.
so you've got a little background music here. Sorry, just I missed exactly what you said. It could be a
No,
moment for.
a kind of a revival of a kind of a civic function for the church,
Yes, yes,
in Canadian
yes.
society.
Yes, yes, and there's a big history of that. I mean, in Canada, the social gospel movement, which really was born in Western Canada after this, well, but in the first half of the last century, was hugely influential in Canadian politics, and including a successive progressive leader. I mean, the father of our Medicare system, Tommy Douglas,
Tommy
was a preacher,
Douglas.
right?
Hmm.
And so that has been part of. It's to have Christian people in leadership in Canada is not unknown. We don't talk about that anymore because we're extremely multicultural, and that's fine. But I think there is an opportunity there for the church to find itself. And I think it did, this is going back now, I'm dating myself, but I think it did a bit after 9/11. I was in parish ministry in those days, and there was a period where, people turned to the church, and they may well
Hmm.
turn to other faith communities as well. I just don't know those faith communities to look for that kind of solace. So I would love to think about the church as a convener of conversation,
Hmm.
and where we bring our values to the table, and so do others. I think that's a very healthy thing.
Hmm. So I actually had a question about what the elbows up thing, and kind of for our American listeners who may not be as aware of that. I think some people are, but um, a little bit because of, I think, Saturday Night Live, and
Right.
Mike Myers. But for
Yeah.
other people who don't know, what does that mean?
Again, I'm not a hockey player. Uh, it's our national sport, even though most of the teams in the NHL are south of the border. Most of the players, I think, are Canadian or
Hmm.
from overseas. So I think elbows up is an aggressive way to play hockey. If you're going to go in the corner, you got your elbows up so you can get that extra dig. All within the rules, of course, because we're Canadians, right? No headshots, nothing above. But it's that sense of. So I actually don't know where that was born. It's something that's just taken root in the last 2 or 3 months, and I don't know where it was born. There is an ad that our current prime minister, who's brand new, Mark Carney,
Hmm.
who's running to be elected, he did with Mike Myers in a hockey rink. And where that's the kind of that's the word that's used. So I don't know where it comes from, but I think it's a Canadian way to think about being resolute
Hmm.
and defensive of our country. So as this non-hockey, non-athletic guy can tell you, that's about as good as I can get.
Okay. Uh, One kind of final question that I have is simply, what is the message that you think Canadian Christians have to give to American Christians, as we're kind of figuring out what's going on in our own side of the border, or at least most of us. Some of us aren't, but a lot of us are. What message do you have to give to us? Either a message of hope, but also maybe a message of something that we need to know that we don't know about your struggles.
I guess it might depend, which American Christians we're speaking to, but I'm going to assume we're speaking
Yeah, yeah.
to Christians with a similar view of the faith and a similar view of how that interacts with society. I suspect part of it would be, we don't understand what happened. We don't understand we don't understand the outcome of your election. We recognize it was legitimate. We don't understand it. We don't want to understand it. I think have courage, and probably in a very Canadian way, I'd say it's not personal. That when you hear Canadians getting their elbows up or not coming to the US or those kinds of relationships feeling strained, I think there's lament in that. Because in our best moments, we recognize that we share a lot in common as Canadians, Americans, but as people of faith and open-minded people of faith, we share the gospel of Jesus Christ. And at the end of the day, that his death and resurrection, which we are about to enter in deeply in Holy Week and Easter, at the end of the day, that is the momentous moment of all of creation. This stuff is real and it's hard and we're living it. But Christ is risen and Christ will come again. And at some deep level, we hold on to the conviction that all shall be well, and that we are siblings in Christ. And let's not let that bond dissipate through this time of turmoil.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've noticed in watching the news is, and seeing everything, is a sense of lament, of a sense of what was, and feeling the uncomfortableness of what is currently, and knowing it isn't personal, but there's still that lament that it should not be this way, and that's hard to take at times.
I just appreciate this conversation. You're the first American I've spoken to since this all happened.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, that this is even in this small little way, we've reached across that border and are able to understand where we each find ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'm thankful for this conversation as well. I think it's important to keep those relationships going, even if governments can't, or in this case, a government, that there are ways of reaching out. And it is great to hear that sense of the hymn society trying to bring people together, and then hoping that can continue in some way.
Let's hope that more of those kinds of conversations happen, both within and outside the church.
Yeah. Well, David, thank you so much for taking the time to.
What a pleasure!
What
a pleasure to enter this conversation, and bless you in your ministry.
Thank you, and you as well.
Bye-bye.
Bye. So what are your thoughts on the episode? And what are your thoughts when it comes to the relationship between our two countries? What does that mean, especially for Christians in both countries? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to send me an email to churchandmain@substack.com. Also, just a little thing. I was going to not have an episode this week, but I was able to try to get some things done that I will am releasing this episode, but it will come out on Wednesday instead of Friday, since Friday is Good Friday. So, just to let you know about that. Also, if you want to listen to other episodes, if you want to kind of donate, visit churchandmain.org. And you can also visit churchandmain.substack.com, where you can read related articles. I just posted my most recent one up that talks about is Donald Trump the man of lawlessness, which is a fancy term for the Antichrist. You'll want to read the article to understand the whole thing. So don't go thinking I've just said that Donald Trump is the Antichrist, but read the article. Also, remember to rate and review this episode on your favorite podcast app. That helps others find this podcast. And I hope that you would pass it this episode along to families and friends who might be interested. So that is it for this episode of Church in Maine. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. I hope that you all have a good Holy Week, especially a good, a memorable Monday, Thursday, and Good Friday, and a joyous Easter. Thank you so much for listening. Take care, Godspeed, and I will see you very soon.